Hey there, it's Susan Pierce Thompson, and welcome to the weekly vlog. All right, I have an interesting topic to talk about today that was spurred by something that happened, a conversation that I had this week. So I have a lot of good friends who do bright line eating, right? And one of them was on the phone with me in the last few days, and she was describing how she's been lately. And she said that recently she went back into the food. She started eating sugar and flour again, and that it kind of worked. It was interesting. She said, I didn't get too depressed or down on myself. I kind of felt good, in fact, and she said, I've been doing a lot of parts work. I've been doing a lot of therapy. Maybe that has something to do with it. She wasn't coming from a perspective of thinking that she would keep doing that forever. She definitely felt like she wanted to get back onto her bright lines, but she just said that basically she was surprised that it had worked. And it reminded me of a time when going back to addictive eating definitely felt like it worked for me. I remember I was in Australia. Now, interestingly, I was deep in the throes of late stage food addiction at this time. I was a mess. I was gaining weight very rapidly. I was desperately trying to stop eating addictively, and I would stop eating sugar and flour, and I could only last for a couple or a few days until I would capitulate again and then binge my brains out. And it was generally horrific. And during that time, I believe I had 9 full-blown attempts to try to get back on the wagon. And I mean like really intentional, full-blown attempts. And each one failed until finally it worked. And I stayed bright then for years. But I remember that some of the times during that stretch when I would capitulate and I would go back to the food, it would feel like such a relief. And I would get a span of time, generally just maybe a day or two, maybe 3, but not more than that, where I'd be so glad to be in the food. I'd be so happy for the freedom to get to eat what I wanted, to be able to use food as a drug, to be able to, go to a coffee shop and order this, and then go to a convenience store and buy that, and just go through my day using food. And I'm reminded about an analogy that I share with you often, or I know I did a whole vlog on it. Maybe I haven't spoken about it often, but it's definitely one of the guiding frameworks for how I think about recovery. And that's the hourglass shape of recovery, right? And the hourglass represents our perceived freedom. And when we start, before we take on a bright line approach to food, an abstinence-based approach to food, where we're trying to abstain from certain foods altogether, we're completely free because we can eat whatever, whenever, right? And meaning we can socialize freely. We can go out to eat. We can go to dinner parties. We can, move in the world freely. And that's the top wide part of the hourglass. And then we learn to get bright. We learn to abstain, right? And our options narrow, and we may reach a point where for a period of time we don't eat out at all. We really feel constrained and concerned about social engagements that are going to involve food. We might avoid them. And it can seem like our world gets very narrow, right? And if during that time, and I need to say, then what happens is it gets wider again, because with diligence and perseverance, your habits of staying bright become automatic. You get practice navigating social events successfully with your bright lines intact, and it becomes more easeful doing that. And then you're in your bright body, you feel great about yourself, your integrity is restored, and you learn you really can move through the world freely and stay bright. And then you've got the best of all worlds, and it widens all the way back out again. And that's, thank you God, that's where I'm at right now, where I can travel the world freely. I can eat out, I can socialize, and I'm bright, and I'm in my bright body, and, it feels great, right? And I have the ultimate freedom. This is what we're hoping for. This is what I want for you. This is what I try to coach people to have. And I have had it sometimes and not had it sometimes, right? Like I'm no perfect person, but the freedom at the bottom of the hourglass is what we're aiming for. So back to the idea of sometimes going back to the food works. If you're in the earlier phases of recovery, either because you're new around here or because you've been in relapse on and off a bunch, and following the bright lines feels restrictive because, you know, your options are narrower, you're concerned about eating out, social engagements feel hard. That constraint, that constriction, that limitation can feel so great to give up, to have it gone, right? To go back to the food, and suddenly things that felt difficult, like going out to eat, feel fabulous because you're like, oh my God, I'll go out to eat. I'll order what I want. It'll be great, right? And that part of us that loves to use food as a solution, that loves to use food as a crutch, that loves to use food as a celebration, a comfort, a friend, something to do, that loves to use food to numb us and to anesthetize us. Oh my gosh, that part of us is just dancing for joy that we've gone back to the food, and you know, that solution is back on the table as an option, right? And I remember even at the worst of my food addiction in Australia, I did have that feeling sometimes when I would go back to the food of freedom and liberation and relief for a bit. But then, of course, what happened is the binges got worse, the eating stopped working, the inflammation built up in my body, the depression settled down in my brain. I started hating my life, hating, you know, my existence, waking up in the morning with a feeling of dread. And also the wanting and obsession became so large, and the enjoyment and the liking got very, very small, and mostly my life became a walking nightmare. And this is something I want to describe also. Some people go back to the food when they're not in the early stage of the hourglass constriction, right? They're actually at the bottom of the hourglass, and they've earned back much, or maybe all, of their freedom. And the bright line approach has been working for them. And they feel great. And they've lost most or all of their weight. And they feel amazing. Now, why would someone like that give that up and go back to the food? Well, often it's overconfidence. It's hubris. It's the, and I know I've talked about this in the vlog a lot, the pernicious feature of addiction that once we're in recovery and our brain has significantly healed, we forget the horror of what it used to be like. And someone can, in that state, think, you know what, I'm going to try some NMD, some not my drink, which means, you know, usually alcohol, right? Or I'm going to eat a little of this or a little of that. I'm going to go on a cruise and just not, you know, sweat the food for a bit, right? And they can go from a state of the bottom of the hourglass where they already have a lot of their freedom, but then picking up the food a little bit can feel like it works at the beginning because it feels like they have their freedom, plus they get to have a glass of wine, plus they get to, you know, enjoy dessert on a cruise. And now it feels like they have the best of all worlds. They're in their bright body. They still enjoy most of their freedom, but now they're having, you know, maybe they're thinking of it as a treat. I hate to talk about those things as treats because they're poison to me, but, you know, they might be thinking of it as a treat that they're getting to have every now and then. And what's happening here in the brain is something that I need to invoke another analogy to explain. It's something I used to talk about a lot, and it's the riverbed analogy. So the riverbed analogy goes like this. When the brain wires up for anything, for guitar playing, for food addiction, for, you know, I don't know, for playing soccer, for anything, when the brain wires up for a new habit, a new skill, a new behavior, what happens is what fires together wires together. These are neurons that are firing together and wiring together. Their synapses are developing more dendrites, more connections. The neurotransmitters are flowing, and fiber tracts start to develop in the brain. I think of these fiber tracts as like rivers, riverbeds, right? The river is like electricity. The water is like electricity, which, the brain is electricity, essentially. Neural conductivity is electricity, and that riverbed grooves over time slowly, right? Water traveling over dry land grooves a riverbed slowly, but eventually, if you keep at it and you keep practicing this new endeavor, you groove a very deep riverbed. Now, this is how addiction forms. As you do some behavior, whether it's eating a bunch of sugar and flour, or smoking pot, or drinking alcohol, whatever it is, you do it again and again, and that riverbed starts to groove its way in your brain. Those fiber tracts start to develop. Let's say then you want to quit. You want to stop that addictive behavior. You have to dam the water upstream. So you build your dam, and now you got all this water that you have to divert elsewhere. Well, that's the Bright Line Eating program. That's all of the, things we do around here to stay bright. That's your new food plan. That's the actions of not eating sugar and flour. That's the way that you go to the grocery store now and buy your vegetables and your fruits and your oatmeal and all that stuff. And you follow this new pathway. Now the water has somewhere new to go, but it feels awkward, unfamiliar. And so it's hard again. This is, again, the earlier part of that hourglass, right? When the water is trying to groove its riverbed, it feels hard and weird and not great and maybe a little constricting at first. But over time, you groove a new riverbed. So now think about someone who's got a fully grooved and formed riverbed for their new bright life. They're at the bottom of the hourglass now. They've got all the freedom of the bright life, and they're in their bright body. And now let's say they decide to let some water back into the old pathway, right? Into the old riverbed. Well, notice they've still got that old dry riverbed in their brain. Those old fiber tracts are still there. They're not being used, but they're still there in potential. They're still there essentially. And if you think about a dry riverbed, it might over the months and years have grown some grasses and maybe even small shrubs in it now that there's no water, right? And if you let just a little bit of water down that old pathway into that old riverbed, it might feel like it's doing nothing but just watering the shrubs a little bit, like no big deal at all. But now if you let more and more water into that riverbed, you're ultimately going to have a river again with all of the consequences of that old river, right? So all of the negatives will come pouring back as you have a rushing river again. But in the early stages, it can feel like not a big deal. In part because the shrubs and grasses kind of blunt the effect of that water, and it can feel like it works for a bit. And, what's actually happening in the brain with addiction as the water sort of flows over those grasses and those shrubs and ultimately washes them away so that you're getting a full-fledged roaring river of addiction again. What's happening is the neural consequences of addiction are starting to take root again. So for example, the healed, healthy brain, when it comes to food, has a nice ratio of liking versus wanting. Meaning there's not much wanting of food. There's a little, but not much wanting of food. But when you eat, there's a lot of liking of food. And in addiction, it's the opposite. There's lots and lots of wanting, lots of the anticipation of food that you might get soon in the future. There's a lot of craving, a lot of obsession, a lot of thinking about the food that you need to get or want to get. But then once you eat it, you actually often don't fully like it. Like it doesn't fully hit the spot. It's not exactly what you need. And so you go look for more. You go look for something else. Maybe you just had something salty, so now you're looking for something sweet, or you had something sweet, now you're looking for something salty, because it's not fully hitting the spot, right? Well, when the addiction riverbed was dry and your brain was healing, or healed, mostly healed, that ratio of wanting and liking might have been restored for you, so that you looked forward to your bright meals some, but it wasn't a big deal. But then when you got to sit and eat a meal, you were like, oh, yay, it's mealtime. I love this. The food tastes delicious. You enjoy it. And then when the meal's over, you're like, okay that it's over. You're not feeling like you're dying 1,000 deaths because you've taken the last bite of lunch, right? Like you're okay that lunch is over. You know that dinner is coming soon. It's fine, right? And so, yeah, the ratio of liking and wanting might be restored. Well, the more you let sugar and flour and alcohol back into your life, the washing away of the brushes and the grasses is going to be the rewiring up of a wonkadoodle ratio between liking and wanting, so that the wanting starts to take over and the liking starts to go down and down and down, and you get trapped again in that hell of wanting food all the time and then not even liking it that much when you get it, right? And it takes time for that to come back. So at first, when you pick up the food, you might be in the state of having that lovely healed brain and just liking the food a lot. And now you're liking like dessert and a glass of wine. And this feels extra nice because, oh my God, it's really working for you. And you sort of forget that in due time, it won't work, right? So if you could handle one more analogy, I think of flushing a toilet, right? Addiction is it's just going down the drain. It's like addiction is just a swirl down a drain and you're going down. But if you think about how water goes down a drain, it might kind of curve up a little bit. That flushing water might, as it swirls around, swirl up a nice little bit on its arc to ultimately then swirl down and down and down and down and down the drain. So I guess I offer this just so that you know sometimes that if you go back to the food, it's not really a big shock if sometimes it works at first. And you can have the meta picture of eventually it won't work anymore, right? The working at first is a temporary phase that's followed by the reality crashing in as your brain changes again the way it did before. And then you're in a state where it doesn't work because maybe your health is deteriorating. Maybe your self-concept is deteriorating, right? All the things that led you to bright line eating in the first place, they're still waiting for you. It just might take a little bit for those consequences to gain traction again. And, you know, how long that takes is going to depend. It's going to depend on all sorts of things. I would say most notably where you're at on the susceptibility scale. Like in Australia, I never got more than 2 or 3 days of it working. Sometimes I barely got 2 or 3 bites before I was hating it again and thinking, why am I back in the food? I hate this. But sometimes I would get 2 or 3 days, you know, and it's just important to look at the meta picture that ultimately it doesn't work. Now, the last thing I want to say is that we need to be mindful also that we have parts. And so odds are you've got a part of you that's more inclined to see the ways it's working, right? We call this a food indulger part, right? It likes to use food as a go-to strategy, and it's so happy and relieved when you go back to the food. And then there's other parts of you, maybe a health monitor part of you, a food controller part of you, maybe a body controller part of you, right? Maybe your highest self that is looking at the big picture and saying, this doesn't work on balance, right? It doesn't work for all kinds of reasons. So if you're trapped in the war between the part or parts of you that think it's working and the part that doesn't think it's working, or the parts that don't think it's working, what do you do about that? That can be a really tricky one. It can be a really tricky one. And I have lots of other vlogs on all that, but basically it's going to require a new surrender and then a bunch of actions, you know, that ultimately turn into habits. But oftentimes patterns of breaking and resuming can be really entrenched because of this honeymoon effect, where at first when you pick up the food, it can feel like it's working for a bit, right? And I see a lot of people who are lower on the susceptibility scale go through these cycles for years. You know, they'll be bright for quite a while and they'll feel like it's really working, but a part of them really misses the food and the alcohol, and then they'll go back to the food and the alcohol and it'll kind of work for a while, and then, you know, a couple years later, all the consequences have built up, months or years, you know, I don't know, weeks or months or years later, the consequences have kind of built up again, and then they come back to being bright, and people can do these cycles for years, right? And so I just think it's helpful to have the meta picture that if you have any significant amount of addiction on board, that means like you're a 6 or above on the susceptibility scale, remember that addiction is progressive, which means that over significant stretches of time, it gets worse on average. The spans of time where it works will get shorter and it will work less well. And the spans of time where there are consequences and it doesn't work will get longer, and the consequences will become more severe, especially as you age. We're all aging every day, right? Especially as time marches on, those consequences will get more severe. And I just offer this as a gift, perhaps, so you can see the big picture. If you pick up the food and it actually feels like it's working, that can happen sometimes. It really can. So that's the weekly vlog, and I'll see you next week.